Welcome to South of Left Field. My name is Jimmy and I want to talk about the topic of the day, the title of this particular little vlog, Standing on Shaky Ground. What we are confronted with today, and you note I'm diving straight into this because I got a couple things to say, is probably one of the most dramatic changes in economic conditions since the Great Depression. And I make reference to the Great Depression because there's something I want to talk about as a political thought, a consideration for what's coming. Now, back in the time of the Great Depression, okay, we're talking the stock market had crashed in 1929, and this was due to people borrowing credit, which was newly available, something that hadn't been seen before, buying cars and major appliances on timed payments, which loans, credit. And what had essentially happened was people lost everything because when the stock market crashed, of course, the upper class was just completely devastated. But a large number of the middle class and people who were able to borrow money were also heavily tied into that market, and they got gutted as well. A lot of the credit began to disappear, and it was a disappearance of credit that really brought on the Great Depression. Now, when FDR assumed the presidency, and in his inaugural speech in 1932, he made a reference to the fact that the halls of power had been vacated by the money changers. And what he was talking about was a fact that the upper class in America, which had been running the country pretty much any way they chose, had taken not simply a financial beating, but a serious moral beating as well. As people had their farms ripped away, as people had their homes ripped away, as families were torn apart, and people were reduced to relying on charity and soup kitchens just to keep body and soul together, they all knew in their minds who was to blame, and that was that upper class. And I imagine that there was a tremendous amount of hatred that we don't hear a lot about in our history here. Remember, history is written by the upper class for the upper class to glorify the upper class. If you don't believe it, take a look at some history books sometimes, and what you'll see is they talk about members of the upper class. They talk about kings and queens and nobles and dates and generals and field marshals and emperors, and they don't talk about us. So what this laid the foundation for, though, going back to the Great Depression, was that when FDR came into office after the essentially do little or nothing Herbert Hoover, he suddenly found himself confronted by a very significant, very challenging situation. Every financial institution and every financial principle and all of the financiers that played the game had disappeared in fear and humiliation. And looming on the horizon was a possibility that people might begin to turn to something different, like communism. Well, I mean, this was a fillip for the communists. And unions, which people in the upper class associated with communism. As a matter of fact, anything that the lower class does to make their lives better or to have a greater voice, either in government or in the operation of business, is always considered communist or socialist in the eyes of the upper class. If it helps us, well, it has to hurt them, because sitting here south of left field looking at the game, looking at the playing field, everybody's in the stands, right or left or out behind the center field. There's only two teams on the field, and they occupy the center and the right field, and there's nobody out there in the left because the owners of the teams are going to howl to the moon if something from the left even begins to look like it's going to appear. And in a way, a lot of that happened back then. FDR was accused of a lot of socialist and communist leanings and activities and behaviors. But the thing is, in my opinion, the fact that he had such a free hand in government, such a free hand to put so many things in place, to try so many things. Social Security was one of the things that was established out of it, all kinds of works programs, major infrastructure work, anything that could get people working. Not all of it worked, but, you know, he was doing something the upper class wasn't doing. He was out there trying. The upper class was nowhere to be seen. They were busy counting their money and hiding behind their golden walls. in shame and embarrassment because the edifice they had built had blown up under them like a stick of dynamite. So what we got out of the Great Depression as we moved toward the Second World War was a government that was actually becoming engaged in doing what I believe government should do, and that is taking care of the citizens, because the country is its citizens. If the 90% ever got up and left, the 10% that would left would be lucky to be able to feed themselves. They wouldn't have jack squat. Because as long as you have people, you have a country. As long as you can have people working together in whatever form, you can establish a government, you can rebuild an army, you can rebuild an infrastructure. You've got to have people. And we're finding that out today in the struggles that we're going through. So the upper class, they gave up the levers of power. They retreated in humiliation. FDR went out there, and of course, slings and arrows and accusations. Everybody that was supporting the upper class was screaming and howling that he was tearing the country apart when he was actually trying to save it. He was trying to do some things to help us, because we'd have been part of the dispossessed in that time. So what is different today? Well, what is different today is the upper class doesn't have to face the embarrassment of the complete failure and collapse of their little house of cards. It's not so obvious. Now, it should be getting obvious, though. It should be getting obvious because the mechanisms of government that used to exist, that would have possibly given us some advanced warning and allowed us to start taking action to address this pandemic, were disbanded. The stockpiles of medical material were built up 20 years ago and left to rot. And now the strategic reserve, people will get boxes of masks 10 years out of date that when you open them up, they just fall apart from dry rot in your hands. A lot of the respirators don't work. There are so many failures in government, and there are many more failures coming. Yes, we've all been promised money. Well, the creaky, falling apart IRS, the system that's supposed to do that, there should be a branch of government that's maintained. Yes, I hate paying taxes too, but right now we need them to disperse money to the citizens of this country to allow them to try and get by during this pandemic. And they're relying on systems based around a computing language, COBOL, that was invented in 1959. A creaking system falling apart with obsolete equipment, 20% staff reduction since the last time they tried to issue a stimulus check back in 2008, 2009. 20% less people, 20% less budget, no upgrades to their system. I don't care what kind of lies you hear coming down from the pulpit above, but the IRS can't do what it's not staffed and what it's not equipped to do. And they're not alone. Small business is going to have the same problem. Businesses are already running into those troubles. What we have today is a serious situation that will allow for revolutionary change, but unfortunately that revolutionary change is going to come from the upper class because they have not relinquished the buttons and levers and dials of power. We can't blame them for the pandemic. But what we need to understand is everything they have done from the time when they began to reassert themselves after the Great Depression to this day, all they have done is occupied government with members of the upper class, funded by members of the upper class, lobbied by members of the upper class to serve the upper class. And all of the levers and dials that they're twisting and pulling right now, and all this money they're spending, okay, this noise, $2.2 trillion, well, guess what? It's $4.5 trillion in sort of loans and other things on the side. $4.5 trillion behind that. That is dedicated entirely for businesses and for state activities, government activities. $4.5 trillion. If you want to know how much of that $2.5 trillion that they talk about up front, we don't even get $1 trillion. I mean, if you sit down and play with the math, and I've done some piddling with the math, we've got about 128 million households. You know what? I can't come up with even $400 billion going directly into the pockets. of us here in the lower class. And yes, I count us in the lower class as going all the way up to the household income of $150,000 because, folks, $150,000 a year does not get you into the upper 10%. I mean, it's a nice living. It's the high end of we, the 90%. But even counting in that high end of the 90%, $2.5 trillion, we don't get 400 billion of it. That's 2.1 trillion going into, businesses of the upper class. And another 4.5 trillion in various forms of funding backing even that. And that's because the hands at the lever of power are the hands of the upper class. Herbert Hoover in all of his kind, from the stock market crash in 1929 through the early days of the Great Depression, were utterly and completely incompetent when it came to addressing the pain of the country as a whole. It is a small miracle that the country did not turn to communism and a major revolution did not occur in the United States. It is amazing to me that it did not. And I firmly believe that FDR, in his efforts as the maverick he was, to get the government active in doing things to take care of we the people, probably staved off such a revolution. And he kept this republic working. He kept this republic viable in people's minds. People were so dedicated to him, they elected him to the presidency 4 times. There was a lot of love for him, and he brought in a lot of people at the time that were considered radical, were progressive, were true liberals, something you won't find today, real liberals. These were people whose interest was helping Americans in general. We don't have any such situation now. People who want to say this is an opportunity for a revolution, like the one that we had under FDR after the Great Depression, don't really seem to get history. FDR did it because the upper class retreated in shame from their failure. Well, it's the upper class that are up there doing it now, and I guarantee you there's not going to be an FDR to be found. And when they're done twisting knobs and pulling levers, all the money is going to flow into each other's pockets up there. And our younger generation, who is being devastated by this economic calamity, are going to be left to suffer the rest of their lives, and they're not going to recover. That's not what the upper class wants to see. They don't want them to recover. They just want to be wealthy, and they want to stay in power. So that's it from South of Left Field. I'm sorry I don't have better news and better prognoses to give you, but that's what I see sitting here outside of the playing field and outside of the game. Please join me in South of Left Field. Please like, please share. Get out of the two parties. Stop playing their game before we lose even our votes.